Moscow began distributing the Sputnik V COVID-19 shot via 70 clinics on Saturday. It marks Russia's first mass vaccination against the disease, the city's coronavirus task force said. Though final trials have yet to be completed for Sputnik V or a second vaccine. And scientists have raised concerns about the speed at which Russia has worked, giving the regulatory go-ahead for its vaccines and launching mass vaccinations before safety and efficacy have been fully tested. The task force said the Russian-made vaccine would be made available to doctors and other medical workers, teachers and social workers because they ran the highest risk of exposure to the disease. Moscow, the epicenter of Russia's coronavirus outbreak, registered 7,993 new cases overnight, well above the daily tallies of around 700 seen in early September. The age for those receiving shots is capped at 60. People with certain underlying health conditions, pregnant women, and those who've had a respiratory illness for the past 2 weeks are barred from vaccination. Russia has developed 2 COVID-19 vaccines, Sputnik V, which is backed by the Russian Direct Investment Fund, and another developed by Siberia's Vector Institute. The Sputnik V vaccine is administered in 2 injections, with the second dose expected to be given 21 days after the first.
President-elect Joe Biden on Friday, while discussing what he described as a grim final jobs report of 2020, urged the U.S. Congress to pass a coronavirus relief bill immediately and to follow up with, quote, hundreds of billions of dollars in more aid in January.
I'm not alone in saying this situation is urgent. If we don't act now, the future will be very bleak. Americans need help, and they need it now. And they need more to come early next year. Congress and President Trump have to get this deal done for the American people.
A government report on Friday showed the labor market slowing in November as the COVID-19 pandemic eclipsed its levels of the spring. The Democratic former vice president offered support for an emerging bipartisan package of around $908 billion in COVID spending that has drawn tentative support from members of both parties in Congress.
But any package passed in the lame duck session is not going to be enough overall. It's critical, but it's just a start. Congress is going to need to act again in January.
Biden has focused heavily on the pandemic and economy during the transition, after a campaign in which he made President Donald Trump's mishandling of the coronavirus a central theme.
A standoff on the streets of Paris, as dozens of hooded protesters hurled projectiles at riot police, smashed up shop windows, torched cars, and burned barricades during a demonstration against police brutality. Police fired back volleys of tear gas. Thousands had set out marching peacefully before the clashes erupted to urge French President Emmanuel Macron's ruling party to scrap a draft security law they fear would curb civil liberties. The bill would restrict rights to circulate images of police officers on duty, which critics say would make it harder to hold the police to account in a country where rights groups allege systemic racism. A backlash against the law was intensified by the beating of a black man, music producer Michel Zecler, by several police officers. The incident was captured on CCTV and mobile phone footage that went viral and headed news bulletins. Violent clashes broke out between protesters and police at a similar protest last week. Brexit talks have gone to the wire, and the leaders of Britain and the European Commission were stepping in to break the impasse Saturday.
Brexit.
Talks were paused on Friday to call in Prime Minister Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen. To narrow differences, sources say centre on French demands for fishing rights in British waters.
Hello, how are you?
Chief negotiator Michel Barnier was non-committal as he prepared to board the train back to Brussels.
We keep calm, as always, and if there is still a way, we will see.
Months of negotiations have barely moved on the 3 thorniest issues: fishing rights, fair competition guarantees, and ways to solve future disputes. But neither side has walked away either, showing there are still hopes of reaching a deal. Almost $1 trillion worth of trade is at stake. Fishing accounts for less than 1% of Britain's GDP, but for Brexit supporters it's a symbol of sovereignty. Britain formally left the EU at the end of January, but is currently in a transition period. If no deal is found, it faces a messy divorce at the end of the year, just as it and the rest of Europe grapple with the vast cost of the pandemic. Talks soured on Thursday, when a British government source said the EU had disrupted talks by trying to force further concessions, and France warned it could rebel. A no-deal Brexit is a nightmare scenario for business and investors, who say it would snarl borders, spook financial markets, and sow chaos through supply chains.
Organisers of the Tokyo Olympic Games have been counting the cost of the decision to postpone the event until next year and say they believe it could cost an additional $2.8 billion. The Games were scheduled to take place this summer but put back a year in the hope that spectators could safely attend and athletes' health could be guaranteed. The extra costs are expected to come through a combination of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, the organising committee and the Japanese government. Tokyo 2020 CEO Toshiro Muto.
Tokyo's cost is Tokyo's cost. The IOC is involved in various activities around the world, and they have accountability to these organisations. Therefore, we initially agreed to keep it separate.
The International Olympic Committee has previously said it will contribute $650 million towards covering postponement costs. This figure is separate from the costs announced by the Japanese organisers on Friday. Tokyo 2020 President Yoshiro Mori also added that the IOC had agreed to waive any additional royalties accrued by new sponsorship deals secured by the organising committee.
Oil prices jumped around 2% on Friday, heading for a fifth week of gains. It comes as major producers agreed on a compromise to continue some cuts to production. They've been trying to find a way to cope with coronavirus hit demand. Although the cuts fell short of expectations, the market took it as good news. Brent was up 1.9% in early deals. West Texas Intermediate rose 1.6%, having risen nearly 1% in the previous session. OPEC and Russia on Thursday agreed to ease deep oil output cuts from January by 500,000 barrels per day. It means the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and Russia, a group known as OPEC Plus, are set to reduce production by 7.2 million barrels per day, or 7% of global demand from January, compared with current cuts of 7.7 million barrels per day. In a report after the decision, though, Goldman Sachs said the move reinforces our conviction in a steady and sustainable rally in oil prices through 2021. Also supporting prices on Friday, a bipartisan $908 billion aid plan gained momentum in the US Congress on Thursday.
Next year, you won't need to get off your couch to catch Warner Bros.' biggest 2021 box office titles. Warner Bros. Studio on Thursday announced it would make all of its 2021 films available in theaters and on the HBO Max streaming service on the same day, an unprecedented shift in movie viewing in response to the health crisis that has upended the movie industry and shuttered movie theaters around the world. Big titles, which are expected to include Godzilla vs. Kong, Mortal Kombat, a new version of Dune, and a Matrix sequel, will be available on HBO Max for 1 month starting on the same day they debut in cinemas. Studios have been pushing to make their movies available in living rooms sooner than the typical timeline of roughly 90 days after they debut in cinemas, an idea theater owners have been fighting. Warner Brothers executives said the strategy would be in place for 1 year, beginning on Christmas with the dual release of Wonder Woman 1984, simultaneously in US theaters and on HBO Max. The new strategy from Warner Brothers unnerved investors in theater chains. Shares of AMC Entertainment, the world's largest theater operator, fell nearly 16%. Rival movie theater operator Cinemark's shares dropped almost 22%.